How are you feeling? I'm going to ask you to take a couple of minutes and write down your thoughts if you can, if you have something to write with, or think about it, make mental notes, jot something on your phone, however you want to take some notes. Ask yourself such questions as, am I sitting in a comfortable but alert position, or am I scrunched over and not breathing deeply? Am I pleased that I was able to make this session today? Do I wish I prepared myself for this by having a notepad and pen nearby? What is distracting or trying to distract me right now? For example, I'm hungry. I wish I'd taken a bathroom break. Should I really be spending my time on this rather than prepping for tomorrow's class or meeting or encounter with a student? So I'm just going to ask you to take a minute and a half or so. Think about, how are you feeling? Let me just interrupt you and add, this is not for sharing, this is for self-reflection. Okay. Minimize this. How do you think how you're feeling will affect your experience of this presentation positively and or negatively? And as before, we'll take a minute, and if you would write down, make mental notes, jot in your phone, ask yourself such questions as, if I'm sitting scrunched over and not breathing very well, will I become drowsy because I'm not breathing right, and therefore I also won't pay attention? Will I be able to focus if I really need to go to the bathroom? Am I annoyed with and kicking myself for not coming prepared? Will I be fully engaged, or is what's distracting me likely to draw me away mentally? Again, about a minute and a half. Okay. And now, once again, take a minute, write down, make mental notes. Consider such possibilities as, I could change my chair so I'm sitting more erect and upright and therefore breathing better and I'll be more alert. I could step away from the computer and go to the bathroom, even though I'll miss a few minutes of the presentation, but at least I'll be able to fully engage when I come back. I could just be in the moment and not beat myself up for what I didn't do. I could make a decision about whether fretting about preparing for tomorrow is going to prevent me from being present, and decide either to focus on this presentation or log off and do the work that I'm really thinking about right now, and I'll just wait for the recording. Again, in a minute and a half. Okay. So that's metacognition. One of the most important practices we can teach our students about learning. When I got to this point, when I first prepared this presentation, I thought, well, that's it. I've said everything there is to say. Obviously, I'm going to say a lot more, but that's the kernel of it. Metacognitive practices promote attention to learning, what affects it, and what can improve it for you as individual learners. It really means making the unconscious conscious. And once it's like, am I slumped over and therefore I'm not breathing? Maybe you should sit up. Because once it's conscious, you can change it. By the way, that's the exact same phrase that we use about implicit bias. Once it's conscious, you can work on changing it. When we first went online a couple of years ago, we really stressed metacognitive practices because so much of online learning needs to be mentally managed. But with return to in-person learning, we have a great opportunity to help students learn to be learners. And by the way, I know a number of you here are advisors. This works for your interactions with your students as well, really well. The prompts I used just now were intended for you here, but they're especially effective for students when they're not in class, when they're doing an assignment or a project on their own, or when they're working in a group or team. Metacognitive practices are also particularly important for Gen Z. I know that this is a generalization about a group of people, but they do have, relative to prior generations, demonstrably shorter attention spans, and they have an unfortunate penchant for multitasking. Metacognition can help them become conscious of their own unconscious behaviors while also strengthening their learning. So as they approach a particular activity or an assignment, ask them to monitor what they're learning about themselves in the process and evaluate how the process went in different contexts, like when they're listening to a lecture or participating in a discussion? Like, are they anxious because they're sitting afraid they're going to be called on? And how does that affect their engagement with the class and their ability to learn what's being discussed? Ask them to self-reflect when they're doing different kinds of assignments, like reading, a making activity, group work, different activities like quizzes or response papers. Ask them to ask themselves questions like, how did I go about approaching the assignment? And that means, for instance, what room was I in? Was it quiet or noisy? And how did that affect my attention to the work? What chair was I in, again, and did it help or hinder? It's like, it was so comfortable that I found myself falling asleep. What was difficult for me in this lecture, and why might that be? Here's one I really like. How was I holding my body during the discussion? And might that signal something about how I was feeling about the discussion? And might that have affected how I learned what we were talking about? What would have helped me understand this lecture or this reading more easily? What did I do when I noticed my mind has wandered while watching the assigned video? How many times did I check my phone when I was reading that paragraph? And why did I? As I said, this is about making conscious the unconscious activities, practice, habits, and ways of being that affect learning. Metacognition is also an inclusive practice that has been demonstrated to strengthen learning. There's a book that I'll show the link to at the end called How People Learn. It was an extensive study into neurocognitive processes of learning around the effectiveness of metacognitive approaches in improving student learning. It works, and it's actually really kind of simple. All right, back. No. Where did I go? This is, I told you I was going to have some problems. Okay, here we go. What happened? Don't know what happened there. Okay, back to slideshow. You can only do one thing at a time. Your brain can only focus on one thing at a time. The other day, so the slide is, if I ask a question in the chat field, will I miss something that's being said? If I ask myself, if I ask a question in the chat field, will I miss something that's being said? Will I miss something that's being said? I didn't do this the other day. We were hosting a presentation and there was a question in the chat field. I responded to it and realized that I had missed what my co-presenter had said. She was talking about multitasking, and I had just proven what she was saying, which is that you cannot multitask. But I didn't know that because I didn't hear her, or rather I wasn't listening because I was reading the question and then writing a response. Gen Z thinks they can multitask well, and we need to disabuse them of that notion because it negatively impacts learning. I'll talk a little bit more about neuroscience because it includes words that I love to say, like amygdala. The important point is that they become aware of its negative impacts. And once they do, they can begin to make those unconscious habits conscious and check themselves, stop themselves from picking up the phone. Because once they become aware of it, they can try to change it. What I'm doing is I'm dragging my cursor between two different screens, and sometimes it gets stuck. So we as faculty can be metacognitive in our approach to this moment as teachers and as learners ourselves. So many exchanges with colleagues, with students, with staff over the last couple of years have begun with, how are you? How are you right now? Recognizing where we are, how we're feeling, and how that affects how we're thinking and what we're doing means we can begin to think about what we might change. Okay, So many faculty are familiar somewhat with Bloom's taxonomy, because one of the practices that we try to do is not assuming that everybody is seeing the same thing or that everybody can see. This is an image of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 increasingly smaller rounds or like donuts with some descriptors in ribbons coming out from each one. And the base of it is remember. Bloom's taxonomy was created in 1956 under the leadership of the educational psychologist Benjamin Bloom in order to promote higher forms of thinking in education, such as analyzing and evaluating concepts, processes, and procedures, rather than just remembering facts, which is rote learning. This one is the original taxonomy of learning and the one that's most frequently referenced in higher education. One value of showing this to students is that the foundation is remembering. Students think they don't need to remember anymore because all they have to do is Google whatever on whatever devices in their hands. But it's important to embed knowledge in your mind because it helps the brain make connections that Google might not make across different subjects, processes, and domains. And memory is a foundation of creativity. We have to remember things to develop higher forms of thinking and learning. So true, you can Google it, but you can't Google these other ways of thinking and knowing. This illustration is revised somewhat from the original, and while it appears to represent a hierarchy, and that's the way Bloom's group originally thought of it, in the intervening years, people have experimented with non-hierarchical representation, one of which I'm going to show you in a couple of slides. It's worth noting that certain teaching methods like lectures facilitate learning at a more basic end of the taxonomy spectrum, while problem solving, writing, and interactive strategies like discussions, debates, and role playing encourage higher order learning processes like analysis and evaluation, and of course, creativity. Some faculty teach Bloom's taxonomy to students as part of intentional learning practices, teaching students how to learn. I'm going to talk about that, how one approach that you could take to actually teaching Bloom's taxonomies. But before we go there, I want to introduce a couple of others. The affective domain. This is, by the way, the image looks like the previous one. The previous one was red. This one is purple, various hues of purple graduating towards lilac and white. Describing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different increasingly smaller donuts or rounds with descriptors streaming out from them. The affective domain includes areas where we deal with things emotionally, like feelings, values, appreciation, motivations, and attitudes, and asks you to create opportunities for students to develop awareness, attention, understanding of cultural differences, ethical standards, self-reliance, and cooperation. The affective domain, emotions and values, tends to be neglected in higher education, but particularly now with all that students have been through and are experiencing, thinking about students' emotions in the context of your course content sets the stage for more open interaction and builds trust. So at the base is receiving phenomenon, being open and willing to hear. Above that is responding to phenomena by participating, paying attention, and reacting to it. Then valuing is identifying and internalizing the worth of what they're encountering. Above that is organizing those values into creating a personal value system. And finally, at the pinnacle is developing a value system that actually motivates and determines our behaviors. And then the last of Bloom's taxonomies is the psychomotor domain. Those of you who work in performance and in making spaces are quite familiar with the psychomotor area, which includes physical movement, coordination, and the use of motor skills. Development of these skills requires practice, and is measured in terms of speed, precision, distance, procedures, or techniques and execution. They range from rudimentary manual tasks like digging a ditch to complex psychomotor skills used in drawing, painting, making a hat, playing the oboe, or dancing. Even if it's not connected to the content of your course, I would encourage you to embrace some physical activity. Get them out of their chairs, have them stretch, trot in place, do jumping jacks. It's good for mental health to get physical, and students will likely be better focused afterwards. And if you can, make it fun. Laughter is a tremendous stress reducer. Just very briefly, this image is the same as the two previous, a series of increasingly smaller donuts arising to a pinnacle. At the base is using sensory cues to guide motor activity, then a mindset of being ready to act mentally, physically, and emotionally, learning by practicing, copying, and trial and error, then developing increasing confidence in performing movements or activities, then increasing proficiency, and then the ability to modify those movements, and then finally creating new patterns of movements. And I apologize, that siren is incredibly loud. I don't know if you can hear. Okay. While Bloom's 3 domains are like pyramids and suggest progression from lower to higher order thinking and experiencing, this one, created by D. Fink, is the taxonomy of significant learning. It's a wheel. It actually looks like a bicycle wheel with 6 spokes, and each like triangle of the pie is a different area of learning. What I really like about this one is it's more holistic and it's iterative. Learning feeds learning. It begins with, in the upper right quadrant, learning how to learn, becoming a better learner, inquiring about things, and becoming self-directed. From there, you move into foundational knowledge, corresponding to the base of Bloom's cognitive domain, remembering and understanding. Then applying those skills, thinking critically, creatively, and practically. And this could also be said to include the psychomotor area because it's skills-oriented. Then integration, making connections among ideas, peoples, realms of life, and incorporating both intellection, mental processes, and emotional processes. Then the human dimension, learning about yourself and others, cognitively, affectively, and through some psychomotor activity. And then what was not articulated really clearly in Bloom, finally in the upper left-hand quadrant, caring, developing new feelings, interests, and values. This is what we're supposed to be doing in higher education, right? In this schema, what we see is that higher order learning is affective, emotional development, not just knowledge. What we should be doing, teaching discernment, how to evaluate, assess, compare, make judgments, make knowledgeable, meaningful, informed judgments, and how to be open to others. And then we're right back to learning how to learn and learning from what we've learned in the previous iterations. What I appreciate about this taxonomy is that it encourages us to remember our students as whole beings. And teaching this taxonomy to our students encourages them to see learning as a continual and iterative process, and especially that learning how to learn and deploying those metacognitive practices helps them build a foundation to be a better student. And it shows that learning leads to caring, developing empathy, and a willingness to embrace difference. Even if we don't like what someone is saying, we can try to understand why they're saying it. Okay, so I said that I would talk about one approach to teaching Bloom's taxonomy. First, it helps students to think about the nature of learning, and that's metacognitive in itself. It also helps them see the changes they could make to their own practices that would improve and deepen their learning. When I originally thought to do this presentation, I thought I would teach, and I forgot to bring the book with me. It's called Teach Students How to Learn. It's written by Sandra Yancey McGuire. These 4 steps are from her book and how she approaches teaching Bloom's taxonomy. I think her approach is appropriate for her students. She teaches chemistry, often required courses, often very large courses, often to freshmen. She needs to bring them from high school level learning to college level. I'm including this here to show one approach you could take. And for those of you who work with first-year students, this is really valuable. Most students have never been taught how to learn, although some students, because they may have learning disabilities, actively think about what they need in order to be able to learn and succeed. I think there's value in introducing Bloom's cognitive domain because it's clear, it's linear, and it's hierarchical. And it starts with remembering. Beginning college students get it. And it's a place to start thinking about, how do I learn? Students can clearly see what remembering is versus understanding, and then versus the higher levels of analyzing and creating. As I said, Finks is more complex because it more realistically addresses the humanity of learning. And I think his approach will really resonate with new school students. I would start with Bloom's cognitive taxonomy, but then, because learning is complex, because being human is complex, I think Finks would show the real interconnectedness of thinking, feeling, and doing. For first-year students, I would probably introduce Bloom's early in the semester, and then maybe introduce Finks midway through the semester after they've had some experience with metacognitive practices about thinking about learning. What's really important is to be explicit. We should be helping students be successful learners, and we can do that by talking about it. It's important to tell students why you've structured your class the way you have, why you chose particular assignments or activities, and how you think those assignments and activities will help them learn, but then also ask them what they actually learned from it. Both taxonomies can help them see how your choices are intended by you to guide their learning. With the introduction of the kinds of questions that I asked at the beginning of this presentation and of these taxonomies, you're helping them think metacognitively about how they learn, and more importantly, how they can unconsciously and consciously affect their learning in negative and positive ways. Okay. So once again, I'm going to ask you to take about a minute and write down, jot, make mental notes. Ask yourself such questions as, do I need to keep sitting here? Many of you, I think, don't have your camera on anyway, but if you do have your camera on, do I need to keep sitting here with my camera on? I really need to stand up. I'm going to walk around. I'm going to use my cordless earphones. Or you might think about how, if that's what you've been doing, how that's affected your engagement. Has my mind been wandering in and out of this presentation? Do I wish it were going faster, and why? Take a minute. Okay. Now, again, ask yourself such questions as, if I'm so focused on my discomfort, will I associate discomfort with the ideas I'm being introduced to? If my mind has been wandering in and out of this presentation, am I really getting anything out of it? If I'm impatient with the presentation, am I shutting down and not learning or resisting what's being said? And why might that be? Take a minute. Okay, last one. Again, we'll take a minute. Are there any changes you could make that might positively affect how you're experiencing today? Consider such possibilities as, those of you who have your camera on, I'm going to turn it off, stand up, walk around. I'm just going to focus on the slides and the presenter's voice. And you might add, and why do I think that's going to be effective in helping me engage or learn? Ask yourself or think about, this wasn't what I was expecting, and I'm not focusing, so I think I'll just leave and hope I don't offend her. I'm going to take some deep breaths and try to really focus on what's being said and shown and not be so impatient. Or, this just doesn't seem like the right time for me to be doing this because I'm just too distracted by whatever is in my mind. Since this is optional, I'm going to wait for the recording and listen to it and watch it when my mind is more focused because I'm really interested in the subject. Once again, take a minute. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing for now, and everybody's going to have disappeared. Whew. I was a little worried there, because I can't see anybody but the presentation, and I'm thinking, oh my God, suppose I unshare and nobody will be there. That would be a really good trick. I just wanted to pause here for a moment, and because I'm about to shift gears a little bit. So any questions on what we've been talking about thus far? Please just feel free to unmute yourself. Or post in the chat, because I also can't see the chat while I'm doing it.
Yeah, I have a question, if that's
Sure,
okay.
JD, please,
hi.
please.
So, it's very rare that college level students are asked to study unless they're doing a foreign language course, it's very rare that college level students are asked to study, index cards or really memorize facts these days. And I know that there's a ton of research that shows that being tested on memory helps you retain facts. So I'm wondering if you would recommend actually adding those kinds of assessments into a syllabus and really getting kids to just, do some rote memorization, which has really fallen out of fashion. But whether that might be just a really interesting skill for them to learn, or if this is something that you want to just be more like chill about and suggest it, or whether it's something you really we should be integrating into our lesson plans.
Very interesting question. And if others have thoughts, be very interested to hear them. My immediate thought is the reason why we stress it is to tell them why it's important. So I'm not so much sure about memorization as,
Got it. Okay.
Did you get the distinction? It's
Yes,
important
I
to
do.
remember things, okay, as opposed to rote memorization. Although it could be fun, like if you devise like a little almost game-like experiment,
Mhm.
that could be fun and interesting.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anything else before I move on into my big words about neuroscience? Okay, the next slides are not particularly compelling, so I'm going to put the slide up. Okay, so now we're going into sort of the science, what we know about brain, how brains work and learning. Screen share. No, not that one. Oh, that's where it got confused. Okay. Okay, share. So the myth of multitasking. You cannot do it. You can do one thing and then another thing, but you cannot do two things well at the same time. I find that I actually can't talk on the phone and do anything, including walk. I mean, I can, but I know I'm not listening well, or I'm listening and also paying attention to my surroundings, and that's hard and stressful. So really, you can focus on one thing and do it really well, or you can try to do multiple things and do each of them somewhat mediocrely. Multitasking releases powerful stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, that negatively impact the parts of the brain that are responsible for short-term memory recall and long-term memory consolidation, decision-making, and executive function. I'm going to say that again. Multitasking releases stress hormones that negatively impact the parts of the brain that are responsible for short-term memory recall, long-term memory consolidation, decision-making, and executive function. I'm going to explain a little bit more about this in the next few slides. Worse, if you're multitasking, includes looking at Instagram, TikTok, checking your text messages, you're being encouraged to keep doing it, because the part of the brain that's responsible for decision-making and self-regulation has a novelty bias. It loves shiny things and it is easily distracted. And it feels good because doing it releases bursts of dopamine. So you keep doing it, thinking you're actually accomplishing something. The constant shifting of attention uses as much energy with stupid and tiny decisions as it does for big ones. It's exhausting and it's stressful. Stress is an enemy of learning. So I'm going to talk about some parts of the brain now and their interactions. The really important part is the last thing that I'm going to say on this slide, which is, in short, science suggests that if we want our students to learn, we should do what we can to encourage metacognitive practices to promote self-awareness and encourage them to use stress-reducing practices to lessen their anxiety and promote self-regulation. Stress and trauma trigger the deepest parts of the brain, the reptilian brain, that includes a structure called the amygdala. It's the fight, flight, freeze part of the brain that keeps us alive by making us run when a lion approaches our hut, or makes us scream, if you're like me, when a huge spider drops on my shoulder. When the amygdala senses danger, for instance, when we are stressed and experiencing trauma, it triggers the release of cortisol and adrenaline, the same as multitasking does. A part of the brain called the hippocampus plays a role in forming declarative memories. Declarative memories are consciously recallable memories pertaining to facts and knowledge. That gets at Genevieve's question earlier. After multiple instances of recalling particular declarative memories, the hippocampus then plays a role in putting those memories together and transporting them to other regions of the brain, the cerebral cortex, where things get put together. And that's how we learn to make connections. The hippocampus plays a major role in memory consolidation, but because it contains a large density of cortisol receptors, if there's too much cortisol around, the hippocampus can actually become overwhelmed and unable to do the job it's supposed to do. A coarse way to summarize the entire phenomenon is that people experiencing trauma and stress, like COVID, like return to in-person, like do I mask or do I not mask, like I didn't do the assignment today, like I'm stressed about my partner, that is, those whose brains are excreting excessive cortisol can actually suffer short-term memory loss and have difficulty with long-term memory retrieval. It's what we've all been experiencing the last couple of years. So to repeat, in short, science suggests that if we want our students to learn, we should do what we can to encourage metacognitive practices to promote self-awareness and encourage them to use stress-reducing practices to lessen their anxiety and promote self-regulation. Advances in brain science show that trauma and stress cause a series of neurological and neurochemical reactions that greatly affect two areas of the brain essential for learning. The one that we just talked about, the hippocampus, and the other is the prefrontal cortex, the last part of the brain to develop, the one that's unique to humans. The prefrontal cortex is vital for executive function and self-regulation, skills that enable students and us to plan, to focus attention on what they're supposed to be learning, to remember instructions and information, and to be able to juggle multiple projects successfully. It's the conscious decision-making part of the brain. When those stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, are flooding the system, the prefrontal cortex is less able to do its job. Further, research shows that the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until the mid-20s. We know that current students are already more stressed, anxious, and depressed than prior generations. The world has been upended for the last 2+ years. Throw in climate change, throw in politics, etc. And they don't fully have the capacity to self-regulate because their brains aren't fully developed yet. Now add multitasking. And I will, by the way, Paul just enabled closed captioning. Thank you, Paul. I should have turned it on at the beginning. But I will share these slides with you. Add multitasking, which also releases cortisol and adrenaline. Distressingly, as I said before, the prefrontal cortex is easily distracted. It has a dopamine addiction to multitask because it makes us feel good. But it's depleting energy through trivial decision-making, like deciding whether to rewatch that funny TikTok video, text my girlfriend, or check how many likes I got on my last Instagram post. It's no wonder college students would be having such difficulty learning, making good decisions, and just plain coping. So, again, science suggests that we want our students to learn. We should do what we can to encourage metacognitive practices to promote self-regulation, to promote self-awareness, and encourage them to use stress-reducing practices to lessen their anxiety and promote self-regulation. So on the second part of that, stress reducing practices. Come on, cursor. Where are you? There you are. Where did you go, cursor? Okay, there you are. Tell students that stress and anxiety don't just feel bad, they are bad. They're bad for your physical health, for your mental health, and for the learning that you're paying all this money for. They're spending money for their education. They need to address stress to make it worthwhile. They will learn more. Contemplative practices help reduce stress, improve attention, deepen learning, and improve memory. One of my favorite exercises to have to do with students is to have them take a loose piece of paper and pen and write physically with the pen or pencil for 2 minutes and tell them all that stuff that's buzzing around in your head, write it all out on a piece of paper. And then I very dramatically ask them to crumble it up. And then I stand in the front or in the middle, depending on the room setup, and I hold up the paper recycle bin and I ask them to stand up and toss it in. You'll get hit in the head and they'll laugh because of course it's funny that they just hit you in the head. It's a very simple exercise that accomplishes multiple things. That act of writing is grounding and centering. The act of writing plus the standing up plus the throwing is very physical. And laughter naturally reduces cortisol. I have even used this exercise when we were online, and I just asked them to physically write, crumple it up, and then stand as far away from the device as they can get, and then on my signal, toss it toward the screen. They don't hit you in the head, and it's not quite as funny, but even just that act, everybody laughs. Another one that I happen to like is called finger squeezes, where you hold up one hand and with your other hand, starting at the base of your pinky, just slowly squeeze, squeeze, squeeze up to the tip. And then you do the next finger, what's called the ring finger sometimes. And then you do it with the middle finger, just starting at the base and slowly squeezing up toward the tip. And by the way, every time I demonstrate this, do you hear how I have slowed my speaking? And that is not intentional. It is the measure of how the finger squeezes is actually a very stress reducing practice. So from pinky to your thumb and then do the other hand. It's great just if you're in a meeting or anywhere and you just want to chill out. And then of course there are a gazillion apps out there with the corporatization of McMindfulness. And despite its current ubiquity, mindfulness practices really are effective. And teaching them about them and encouraging them to use them in your class and when they're on their own, whether it's a mindfulness exercise, meditation, contemplation. One thing that I see is not on this list is physical activity. I mentioned it earlier, taking a walk around the block or just standing up and doing some arm swings is really incredibly rejuvenating and stress reducing. Okay, I think we have enough people that I'd actually like to do this as a group, do some breakout sessions. Okay. So these are 2 questions. I'm going to ask you to think about a task or activity that you think you're bad at. And then think about what evidence you have that you are bad at it. And then how you feel when someone asks you to perform that task. And I'm going to ask you to do the exact same thing, but something that you think you're good at. So think about something that you think you're bad at. What evidence do you have that you are bad at it? That's the really important question. And then how you feel when someone asks you to do it, and then vice versa, something that you're good at. I'm going to stop sharing. I thought I was going to stop sharing. What happened? Okay, I did stop sharing. I just didn't know it. Okay, so we're gonna try to do, I'm gonna try breakouts. There we go. And I'm gonna make them relatively small. Thanks, Kesley. Nice for you to join us again. I'm gonna try breakouts and I'm gonna keep them relatively small because I want to be sure that we have time for questions and discussion. Okay, thanks, Paul.
Anybody have anything that they want to share? Maybe they learned about themselves or didn't learn about themselves, or something that came up in the conversation. Keeping in mind that we're not gonna out our breakout partners and say who said what. Feel free to unmute.
I think it was easier to find something you're bad at than actually finding something that you're good at.
Why do you think that is?
I guess because you think more about what you're not good at in general. Maybe. So you focus more on, what's not going so well. I wonder if that's the case for the students too.
And how do we feel when somebody asks us to do something that we think we're not particularly good at?
Yeah.
So many people tend to just beat themselves up on, dwell on the not good and not reflecting on all the things that they're really capable of doing.
Yeah.
Anybody else? I told the one group that I was in that very often what comes up in these is math and anything to do with numbers. And the example that I give is I always thought, now this is also a gendered thing, that I was not good at math. One of my first jobs out of college, I was working with a friend's mother in the days when they had paper checkbooks and you had to carry the math and it was all written by hand. And I made a mistake. And so I had to go back like for weeks and white out. And then in the process of doing the corrections, I made another mistake. And so I had to white out the whiteout and add the corrections. Obviously, I got fired, but I thought that was the incident that scarred me for life. And a few years ago, I found myself in a position where I had to manage, and when I say manage, like line by line item, manage a $30 million budget. And I was absolutely terrified. My hands would shake. And I was so terrified of making a mistake. And I learned that if I closed the door, and if that's all I did, like turn off all, this is before Apple had, focus, turn off all the other distractions and designate a set amount of time and I'm going to work on this, that not only could I do it, I was actually pretty good at it. And the most startling thing was that I enjoyed it. And then when I was doing this presentation last year, somebody else said the math thing, oh my God, the math thing. And then I remembered the summer after second grade when my father made me sit in the living room at my little red table, memorizing the times tables. And I think maybe that a little bit underlies my attitudes and beliefs about myself in relation to math. So somebody, it was R who asked me in the breakout how this connected to the other stuff that we're talking about. So now I'm going to go back to screen share. Actually, first I'm going to do this and show this very intensive graphic. Okay, this is an image. Carol Dweck is a Stanford psychologist, and she wrote a mega million selling book called Mindset. It's a relatively simplistic approach. There are more complex ways of approaching mindset, but this is nice and clean and clear and could be shown to students. It focuses on how implicit frames of intelligence and ability influence motivation, learning, and development. This, just to give credit where credit is due, the graphic was designed by Nigel Holmes and it was modified by my colleague Sheena. As Dweck defines it, fixed mindset is the belief that success or failure is governed by your innate talent or intelligence. It leads to a desire to look smart and a tendency to avoid challenges, to give up easily, to see effort as fruitless, to ignore useful negative feedback, and to feel threatened by the success of others, as though achievement were a zero-sum game, and anything you achieve diminishes me or what I might achieve. As a result, they plateau early and they achieve less than they might. It also confirms their view of the world and is self-fulfilling. Growth mindset is the belief that success or failure is governed by effective effort. Not that you can do anything that you set your mind to, but that you are capable of learning and growing if you work smart. It leads to a desire to learn, and therefore a tendency to embrace challenges, persist in the face of setbacks, and see effort as a path to mastery. You learn from criticism, and you find lessons and inspiration in the success of others, as in, if they can do it, so can I. As a result, they reach ever higher levels of achievement, and this gives them a greater sense of free will. A number of years ago, they did a massive study of fifth grade students. And with each teacher, they told the researchers told the students that 3 of the students in their class had exceptionally high IQ. And at the end of the year, those students performed exceptionally better than the other students in the class. The truth is, all the students in the class had tested at basically the same level. Why did those 3 do much better? Because the teachers believed they were capable of excellent performance, because they held them to very high standards because of that belief and gave them ever more challenging material. They told them they were capable of doing it, causing the students themselves to push themselves further. So again, it's not that anybody can do anything they set their mind to, but you know what? You can probably do a lot more than that fixed notion about yourself or whatever is causing you to resist engaging with whatever the activity is to break through and try. So you can help students by inspiring their own self-belief by expressing confidence in their ability to achieve if they exert effective effort. Remind them that they've overcome difficulties in the past and ask them to think about how they did it. That again is promoting metacognition, self-reflection about what worked. Why might that have worked? Talking about the neurobiological basis of learning with them, about what we've learned in the last few years about how the brain is evolving and changing all the time. I used to want to be a neurosurgeon. So in high school, I studied a lot about neurons and dendrites and pieces of the brain. A synapse is the gap between two neurons across which communication between the neurons occurs. The brain can change via synaptic plasticity. New connections get made and strengthened. Weak connections that are no longer required get eliminated. Changes to the brain can also result from the creation of new neurons. In other words, the brain has the ability to functionally reorganize itself depending on the stimuli available and the tasks required. In other words, it can learn. It's actually how we learn. Teaching students that is part of teaching them how they learn. And I'm checking the time. Okay, good. We have time for this one. I'm going to skip that. Go back to that. Just a question. I'm not going to call on us in the interest of time, but good instruct, true or false? Good instruction makes concepts easy to grasp. My understanding and my area of expertise is foundational to student learning. Talent determines a student's capacity for learning. Probably they're all false. Your area of expertise is important, but it's not necessarily foundational to their learning. As we've just discussed, effort doesn't determine a student's capacity, but effort influences a student's capacity. And concepts don't necessarily be easy to grasp, but good learning practices make concepts easier to comprehend. Now, this slide. This is from a huge amount of work done by an Australian researcher named John Hattie, and it was first published in a book called Visible Learning. He undertook the largest ever meta-analysis of quantitative measures of the effect of different factors on educational outcomes. At the time that it was originally published, it involved over 250 million students and 800 analyses. I really hope that in the spring we'll be able to run a workshop that just focuses on this because there's a lot of information in here. But the thing that I want to point out is this top one is actually by far, self-report grades is by far the most powerful impact method for impacting student learning. What they mean by that is asking students what they think they should be graded and what criteria should be employed in how they are evaluated. I often encourage faculty to do this with their class, to ask the class, say, how are we going to evaluate this assignment? What constitutes A or successful? What constitutes needs to be revised? What constitutes just doesn't make the grade? And really articulating how it will be evaluated and then asking them to apply those criteria to their own work. Formative teacher evaluation. I was kind of surprised in my early days of working with Parsons that I know Parsons faculty are moving away from these practices, but that early on, you got feedback at the end when it was too late for them to incorporate that feedback into the work that they were producing. Whereas if you build it in at various small steps along the way, they're learning, they're incorporating what they're learning, they're revising, updating, and leading to much stronger final outcomes. The one that I really want to show, and I realize there's an error in the slide. I took this slide from a former colleague. Teacher subject matter knowledge really doesn't, I mean, it matters, but it matters insofar as you're incorporating different kinds of learning practices in your teaching. It only matters if the subject matter is underlying how you're helping students learn effectively. And then this is the last slide. And I included, I also took this from Sandra Yancey McGuire's book. You know, when I read it, I'm thinking, this is just weird. But then I thought, you know, do we remember how we were taught how to read? I don't. So we've looked at how metacognition can support and promote deeper learning by making students aware of how they learn and or don't learn and to make changes in response. We've looked at briefly how mindset affects progress. We've looked at how brain neuropathy and stress factor in learning. So how to read. Consider whether or not you would want to teach your students this. I tried it myself. Students really don't know how to read, especially now, because they're so used to reading extremely short, little text messages, little short bursts. Again, we said that short attention span. Most people read, then their mind wanders, but they keep, quote, reading because their eyes are continuing to see the words, and then the mind kind of like comes conscious and realize that it's wandered. So now you have to go back and reread, try to remember where you stopped paying attention, reread, even though you're not really rereading because you didn't read it in the first place. So here are McGuire's steps. Step 1, preview. Look for headers and subheaders, boldface, italics, graphics, and images. This action prepares the brain for pattern recognition and sense making. Step 2 is identify questions you hope the reading will answer. And that provides motivation because now you think, well, why am I going into this? What am I going to get out of it? Step 3, read the first paragraph and paraphrase it. This is so hard to do, but it's worth experimenting with. Next, read the next paragraph, paraphrasing it, incorporating the first paragraph. It seems time consuming, but students report that it actually takes less time than reading, letting your mind wander, and then coming back and doing it all again. It's also beneficial to encourage students to read with the idea of having to teach it to someone else. If possible, build in opportunities in classes for students to teach the material to peers in small groups and use multiple means of engagement, like writing in a discussion forum, recording a video or audio explanation, allowing them to work in small groups, either in class in person or synchronously online. No, I can't give that example. I'm not going to give that example because I want to be sure that we have just a couple of moments. We have an opportunity in this moment to try stuff with our students while we're still kind of in this moment of transition, and to be clear to them that we don't necessarily know how it's going to go. So long as we're explicit about what we're doing, or if we're experimenting on something and why, in general, they'll respond. Final questions, thoughts, comments, or suggestions? Please just feel free to unmute. Okay then. Thank you very, very much for joining today. I will share the PowerPoint and the recording once we clean it up a little bit. And it was great to see you all, even though mostly I saw your screens, but that's okay. I get it. And I did make that option, didn't I? So thank you so much. Really happy to have had you this afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day.